Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time it's all about reading and the benefits of it.
Hmm.
Our source material is this really fun podcast discussion,
Okay.
and they went over, all the reasons why reading is good for you, but what does that even mean?
Right.
So that's what we're going to dig into today, going deeper
Okay.
beyond the surface to see what's going on.
I think you'll be surprised by how reading shapes us.
Yeah.
The podcast that we're looking at even mentions a study about how reading to infants can actually boost their vocabulary, which is wild.
I know, isn't that crazy? They can't even talk yet.
Right.
But it makes you think, what about us grown-ups?
Yeah.
The source material talked a lot about how reading can be like traveling the world without leaving your couch.
Yeah, it really is like a form of mental travel.
Hmm.
One of the speakers even mentioned how reading about the fall of the Roman Empire
Oh, no.
gave them a new perspective on modern economic cycles. So it's not just about learning facts. It's about connecting those historical dots and understanding the present.
That's so true. I remember reading a book about the history of spices, and it totally changed the way I view cooking.
Really?
Suddenly every ingredient I use has this whole backstory.
Wow.
It was like unlocking a secret code.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and that's what's so cool about reading, right?
Yeah.
It unlocks so many different types of knowledge.
Right. One of the speakers talked about reading a personal finance book and how it actually helped them budget better.
Huh.
So it proves that reading can be incredibly practical too.
Okay, so we've got travel history, practical skills, but what about creativity? Does reading actually make you more creative?
The source definitely seemed to think so.
Okay.
They described reading, especially fantasy, as being like watching a movie where you are the director.
Oh.
You get to cast the characters, build the world in your mind.
Wow.
It's so stimulating for the imagination.
Yeah, that reminds me of the sci-fi book I read about time travel. It made me think about all these different paths my life could have taken based on, different choices.
Right.
It was like a mental choose your own adventure.
That's a perfect example of how reading can push us to think outside the box.
Yeah.
But even if you're not reading sci-fi, any type of fiction can spark those what-if questions
Right.
and make us consider different perspectives.
So it's like mental exercise, kind of like a workout for your brain.
Exactly. And just like exercise, reading can help us manage stress.
Really?
There was a 2009 study by the University of Sussex that found that reading can actually lower your heart rate and reduce muscle tension.
That's crazy.
They even compared it to the calming effects of meditation.
I get that when I'm feeling overwhelmed, there's nothing like escaping into a good book.
Right.
It's like hitting the pause button on reality for a little while.
It is. And, the speakers in the podcast even talked about reading before bed to relax and unwind. It's like giving your mind permission to unplug from the day's stresses.
Do you think that's actually helpful, though? Or is it just avoiding your problems? Sometimes I feel like I use reading as a way to procrastinate dealing with real life.
That's a good point. I think there's a balance, right? It's healthy to take breaks and unwind.
Sure.
But we can't just hide in books forever.
Right.
Maybe it's about being mindful of why we're reading. Or are we genuinely seeking relaxation?
Right.
Or are we avoiding something?
That's a good distinction.
Yeah.
So escaping into a book can be beneficial,
Yeah.
but it's important to be aware of our motivations.
Definitely.
Okay, what else did this podcast highlight?
Well, they discussed how reading helps strengthen our focus,
Okay.
which is so crucial in our distraction-filled world.
That's true.
Think about it. We're constantly checking our phones, juggling multiple tasks. It's no wonder we struggle to concentrate.
Yeah, they mentioned mystery novels being especially good for this. Something about the suspense keeping you hooked.
Yeah.
But I've always found that even with nonfiction, you have to really focus to grasp those complex ideas.
Absolutely. Whether you're piecing together clues in a thriller or absorbing information in a scientific study,
Yeah.
reading demands sustained attention. And the more we read, the stronger those attention muscles become.
I wonder, does the type of reading impact our focus differently?
Oh, interesting.
Is reading a novel better for focus than, say, scrolling through social media?
I'd say so.
Okay.
Social media is designed to be fragmented and attention-grabbing,
Right.
constantly pulling us in different directions.
Yeah.
A novel, on the other hand, requires us to immerse ourselves in a single narrative, to follow the plot and the character's development. It's a much more focused form of engagement.
That makes sense. It's like the difference between snacking on junk food versus sitting down to a nourishing meal.
Exactly. And speaking of nourishing, the podcast also touched on how reading can actually make us more empathetic and understanding of others.
I was surprised by that one. How does reading fiction translate to real-life empathy?
Well, think about it. When we read fiction,
Okay.
we're stepping into the shoes of different characters, experiencing the world through their eyes, feeling their emotions.
Oh.
It's like a virtual reality simulation for empathy.
They actually give a great example of this.
Yeah?
One speaker talked about reading a memoir about someone overcoming a major challenge and how it gave them a much deeper understanding of what that person went through.
That's a powerful example.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the transformative power of reading. It can open our hearts and minds to experiences and perspectives that might otherwise remain closed to us.
So we're not just learning about facts, but also about different ways of thinking and being in the world.
Right.
That's pretty powerful.
It is. And it brings us to one of the most profound benefits of reading, its ability to foster personal growth. One speaker in the podcast said something that really stuck with me. Every book you pick up can shape who you are.
Whoa, that's a big statement.
It is.
It makes you think about the impact of the books we choose to read.
It really does. And it underscores the importance of being mindful of our reading choices.
Oh, wow.
What are we feeding our minds? What stories are we allowing to shape our worldview?
It's like we're curating our own mental libraries, right? Filling them with all these voices and ideas. But they also mention this idea that reading can help you get OUT of your own head and see things from different perspectives.
Right. It's that balance again. You know, we shape ourselves through the books we choose.
Right.
But those books also have the power to challenge us.
Yeah.
And broaden our understanding.
Okay, so speaking of shaping ourselves through books, the podcast had some really fascinating points about reading and vocabulary. They even talked about this study from Rutgers.
Oh, wow.
About how reading to infants helps build their vocabulary.
It seems crazy, right?
I know.
Like, how can babies benefit from being read to when they can't even talk? But it's amazing, even at that age, their brains are absorbing language. The sounds, the rhythms.
So it's not just about learning words, but about, like, developing a sense of how language works.
Exactly. It's like building that foundation for communication.
And that framework benefits us throughout our lives.
It does.
They talked about how a richer vocabulary leads to clearer self-expression.
Right.
But they also discussed something I found really interesting.
What's that?
Like, different types of reading impact vocabulary differently.
Oh, that's interesting.
Does reading fiction build a different kind of vocabulary than reading nonfiction?
That's what they seem to suggest.
Okay.
They argued that fiction exposes us to a wider range of vocabulary because of all the descriptive language and character portrayals.
That makes sense.
Right.
Think about all the metaphors and similes you find in novels. It's like they're painting pictures with words.
Exactly. And those word pictures not only enrich our vocabulary, but they also help us appreciate the beauty and power of language.
So reading fiction is like a masterclass in creative writing.
I like that.
I like that too. But they also talked about reading in other languages.
They did. One of the speakers shared their experience learning Spanish through reading.
Oh, cool.
They started with simple children's books.
Okay.
And gradually worked their way up to more complex texts.
Wow.
And they said that it not only expanded their vocabulary, but it also helped them learn grammar in a more natural way.
That's really encouraging for anyone trying to learn a new language.
It is.
It's like immersing yourself in the language without actually having to travel.
Exactly. It's like creating that mini immersion environment in your own mind.
Okay, so we've talked about the cognitive benefits, but the podcast also spent a lot of time on the emotional benefits.
Right.
Especially when it comes to stress reduction.
Absolutely. They described reading as a way to, like, press pause on the stresses of daily life.
It's true.
And I think we can all relate to that. You know, when we get lost in a good book, our worries kind of fade away.
I have to admit, I was a bit skeptical about this whole reading as stress relief thing. Like, doesn't escaping into a book sometimes just mean avoiding our problems?
It's a valid concern. And the podcast acknowledged that they emphasize the importance of being mindful. Like, why are we reading? Are we genuinely seeking relaxation?
Right.
Or are we using it to avoid dealing with stuff?
So it's not just about reading, it's about how and why we read.
Exactly.
But they did bring up that study from the University of Sussex, right?
Yes.
The one about reading, lowering your heart rate and reducing muscle tension.
It does, and it aligns with our own experiences.
Right.
When we get absorbed in a good book, we often feel a sense of calm.
Yeah.
It's like our minds and bodies are finally allowed to unwind
They even talked about reading before bed to help with sleep.
Right, it's like giving your brain a signal to power down. One of the speakers even mentioned how reading a book about mindfulness helped them manage their stress.
So it's not just about escapism, it's about learning coping mechanisms.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So that brings us to another point they made about reading and empathy.
Yes. The more we read, especially fiction, the more we develop our capacity for empathy.
I'm curious, how does that actually work?
Well, when we read fiction,
Okay.
we step into the shoes of different characters.
Right.
We experience the world through their eyes and emotions. We learn to understand different perspectives.
They shared that anecdote, right, about reading a memoir and how it helped them connect with someone's struggles.
That's a powerful example.
It is.
It really speaks to the power of reading. It can open our hearts and minds to the things we might never experience ourselves.
So reading can make us more compassionate.
It can.
That's amazing.
It is, and it underscores the importance of reading diversely. The more perspectives we encounter, the more we learn.
They also talked about reading for lifelong learning and personal growth.
Yes. They emphasized that reading isn't just about accumulating facts.
Right.
It's about expanding our horizons,
Yeah.
challenging ourselves, and evolving.
It's a journey.
It is.
They even compared reading to planting seeds.
Oh, wow.
Each book is like a seed
Interesting.
with the potential to grow into new understanding.
And just like a garden, our minds need tending.
Ugh.
We have to be mindful of the seeds we plant.
Right.
And cultivate an environment where they can flourish.
So it's not just about reading, it's about what we do with the information.
Exactly. It's about engaging with the text, asking questions, making connections, and letting those insights shape us.
It's like we're constantly building these mental maps of the world.
Yeah.
And every book adds a new layer. But they also talked about how reading is super beneficial as we age.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
As we get older, we tend to fall into routines and limit ourselves to new ideas. But reading keeps our brains active and engaged.
I've noticed that with my parents.
Right.
My mom's an avid reader, and she's still sharp as a tack.
Wow.
But my dad, who never reads, he seems to be slowing down a bit.
That's just anecdotal, of course.
Yeah.
But research suggests that reading can actually help prevent cognitive decline
That's interesting.
and even dementia.
Wow.
It's like a workout for your brain.
Keeps it in shape.
Exactly.
And they talked about how reading can give us a sense of purpose as we age.
It's true. Reading can help us feel connected to the world
Yeah.
and give us a chance to reflect.
I love that.
You know, one of the speakers shared how reading helped them through a tough time.
Oh, wow.
They said that reading stories of hope and resilience gave them strength.
That's really powerful.
It reminds us that reading isn't just passive.
Right.
It can be a source of comfort and inspiration.
Definitely. And they ended the podcast with this great line.
Okay.
Every time you open a book, you're not just reading, you're growing, you're learning, you're becoming better.
That's a perfect way to sum it up.
It is. It reminds us that reading is a journey.
A lifelong journey.
So as we finish up this deep dive into reading, we're left with a sense of possibility.
Yeah.
Reading is more than just a hobby.
It's a way to enrich our minds and shape who we are.
It really is. And so with that in mind, I want to leave you with a question to think about.
Okay.
What one book has had the biggest impact on your life?
What a great question.
And why we encourage you to keep reading.
Yes.
Knowing that each book is an adventure waiting to happen.